want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Hey everybody, it's Chris Bunbury here again for JOBLO.com with another Best Movie You Never Saw, and this week we're taking a look at Judgment Night, directed by Stephen Hopkins and starring Emilio Estevez, Cuba Gooding Jr., Stephen Dorff, Jeremy Piven, Denis Leary, and House of Pain's Everlast. In it, four friends from the suburbs, played by Estevez, Gooding, Dorff, and Piven, take a tricked-out RV into Chicago to watch a boxing match, only to witness a gangland slaying. Now the men are on the run for their lives as a psychotic gang leader named Fallon, no, not John Fallon from Arrow in the Head, Fallon, played by Denis Leary, and his crew start hunting them down. In the late 80s, very few scriptwriters were quite as hot as Kevin Jarre. The author of Rambo First Blood Part 2, Glory and Tombstone, he was also the guy who wrote the script for what eventually became Judgment Night, although, as happened in many of his screenplays, the journey from the page to the big screen was not a smooth one. Eventually, his script would wind up entirely rewritten to the point that the sole screen credit goes to writer Lewis Colick, whose earlier thriller Unlawful Entry had been a surprise hit. Indeed, Judgment Night would wind up having a lot more in common with Unlawful Entry than anything by Jarre, but Universal was hoping for a hip, urban thriller with youth appeal, and that's exactly what they got. They recruited then red-hot stand-up comedian Denis Leary, hot off of his MTV series and his comedy special No Cure for Cancer, while Cuba Gooding Jr. was doing this as his follow-up to Boys in the Hood. Emilio Estevez, of course, was coming off of The Mighty Ducks and a decade-long run as a heartthrob off of his days in the Brat Pack. All these elements aside, the movie laid an egg at the box office, only grossing just over $12 million in theaters. Now, if you know Judgment Night at all, I would bet that you know it better for its soundtrack rather than the film itself. The soundtrack, curiously for this film, actually ranks as one of the seminal albums of the 90s. It's insane how beautifully assembled a compilation it actually is, and it harkens back to a time when soundtracks were more than simple playlists. Even The Last Action Hero, which was a big flop in the time, had a soundtrack that kicked major ass. Rather, all of the songs on this soundtrack were actually commissioned for the film by huge artists, but the genius move was the team Rappers and Rockers, and there are some legit classics here like Helmet and House of Pain's Just Another Victim, and Teenage Fanclub and De La Soul's Fallen. Stephen Hopkins himself, in an interview with Consequence of Sound, acknowledged that the soundtrack is a lot more popular than the film. As he said, the album is one of the biggest selling albums of all time. Note to Stephen, it's actually not, but it's very well regarded. I think that people don't know the film very well, said Hopkins. I think they know the idea of the film and the interesting 90s cast that we had. Interestingly, I think the album does portray the idea of the film quite well. If anyone ever watches the film because of the album, that's awesome. Now, the album is a classic, the film is not, but it's still pretty damn good. I'd wager that most people that actually own the album have never actually bothered to check it out, which is a shame. It's a good example of a 90s studio programmer made with energy and flair by director Stephen Hopkins, who actually churned out a lot of good programmers in this era, including several of which I've featured in this column, including Blown Away and The Ghost in the Darkness. Of course, he also made the criminally underrated Predator 2.
You are one ugly mother. Motherfucker.
The film is one of Emilio Estevez's last as a leading man, with him opting to jump behind the camera after a solid decade as a popular star. Throughout the rest of the 90s, he'd mostly just turn up in Mighty Ducks sequels. He's always had an easygoing everyman quality about him, and he's well cast as the young suburban dad trying to get back to his wife and new baby in one piece. He's joined by a very young Stephen Dorff as his little brother, while Cuba Gooding Jr. is the team's tough guy, the one guy who's keen to fight back once they start getting hunted. A very nearly unrecognizable Jeremy Piven, who's clearly had a lot of work done, especially to his hairline since then, plays their fast-talking pal. Due to his billing, of course, I would say that Piven's chances of surviving this movie aren't very good right from the start. It's all driven by a propulsive Alan Silvestri score, and the film is silly in some ways because the urban nightmare these guys are caught up in is done in a way that's clearly intended to scare middle-class suburban America. It ain't exactly The Warriors. More than anything, though, Judgment Night is a star vehicle for Denis Leary, who Hollywood was trying to make into a thing at this time. The bad guy part is tailored very closely to his aggressive, motor-mouthed stand-up persona, as was his follow-up, The Ref, although at times some of his speeches sound more like stand-up rants than realistic talk coming from a drug lord.
I had a guy in a joint one time, cell next to me, and he's used to yap about everything. We used to yap about the food, and yap about the guards, and yap about this, and yap about that, and yap all night long. Fucking yap. Like a fucking 747, you know what I mean? Like an engine stuck right between your ears, and you can't get away from it because he's right next to you, you know what I mean?
His lackeys are actually a lot more menacing, with Everlast from House of Pain bringing authenticity to his part as the crew's muscle, while the ever-intense Peter Green is good as Leary's number 2. So good, in fact, that maybe his role and Leary's roles should have been reversed. A couple years later, he'd play a very memorable villain in the Jim Carrey vehicle, The Mask. When I say Leary's rants sound a bit like stand-up and aren't legit for a drug lord, I still think he's very memorable as the bad guy, and whatever. This is clearly a 90s era Hollywood idea of what a scary drug dealer would be like. Leary goes all in, and I always really liked the bit where Piven negotiates for his life. It's like the darkest ever lost scene from Entourage. I mean, check it out.
No, hold on. We're businessmen, both of us. We have an understanding.
Oh. Let me tell you something, Ray. You don't understand shit, okay? Nothing. Guys like you gotta keep checking your pants to see if you got a dick. I got one. You and your friends are the kind of spoon-fed fucking fruit bait that I fucking hate!
Aries in big trouble, guys. Now, if you want to see Judgment Night, pretty easy to find. You can find it on DVD, Blu-ray from the Warner Brothers archive, and on digital. And as far as 90s urban thrillers go, Judgment Night is a really fun one, and part of me misses these small-scale actioners. If you were to make a movie like Judgment Night now, it would probably be made for streaming or by somebody like Blumhouse, who would pump up the genre elements. This is a down and dirty action flick, and it's a time capsule in more ways than one, and the type of movie I really kinda doubt is ever gonna get made again. I loved it as a kid. I had the VHS copy and it was very well worn, and I think it holds up relatively well. Is it a classic? No, the soundtrack's a classic, but the film itself is pretty damn good, so check it out. And while you're at it, if you like what you see, please subscribe to our JOBLO Videos channel. Tell all your friends who like this sort of content and turn on the bell to receive notifications for all of our latest videos. We're an independent company and we appreciate all of your support.
When the